very much a short, sharp exercise. We start at 6:15 and we expect to finish at 7:15. We hope then you will stay around and talk and drink in the pub. We will start on time. I'm Christine Whitehead. I have been doing housing for longer than all but one person in this audience. There might be two. And at the moment we're doing quite a lot of work on temporary accommodation and homelessness in this context. But this evening we have three speakers, not quite the ones which were advertised, partly because Castan's daughter has her birthday today. Mother didn't realise. So we're going to start with Dr. Bert Provan, who is a research fellow at LSE, in case for the Centre for the Analysis of Social Exclusion, and who has worked in government in lots and lots of data and an enormous number of years in this particular area. So Bert's going to give a sort of overview, and then we will move on to more particular things as we go through. I just wanted to say that one of the problems about this whole homelessness story is, first of all, that, especially given the look of the audience, there's a lot of people who don't actually know how we define homelessness. We don't talk about that, because homelessness is not rooflessness, and rooflessness is what most other countries call homelessness. But it's also an area where we've sometimes spent an enormous amount of money and an enormous amount of policy on. And one of those times was in the early 1990s, when Lincoln's Inn Fields was the centre of where people came to get their soup and so on. And it was an incredible area just next door to us. It's where the big issues started. So we have a real interest and involvement in the location of this thing. And then in 1997, the Prime Minister and others decided that this were, it wasn't really about helping homeless. It was about making sure that people weren't stepping over homeless people, or were affected by how homelessness was working. But they did an enormous amount. It did involve quite a lot of removal of personal choices and rights. So that the GLA, for instance, for a while, actually tagged all long-term homeless people, not with anything particularly dreadful. They tagged it with the information about their health, so that they could get help immediately. But of course it was a very, very different change in the way the world works. We have a rather different system now, one in which homelessness has been increasing very much, very heavily concentrated in London. And Bert will talk about that. Okay. Wherever you need to.
So, good evening, everyone. I'm Bert. And let me just get this up. All right, so I'm going to talk about background about homelessness. And I'm just starting my timer, counting down the 10 minutes I've been allocated to do this. So I'm going to talk about homelessness. Christian has said, say a bit about what it is and address the question, why is it such an intractable, wicked problem? Why is it so difficult to deal with homelessness satisfactorily, deal with the needs of homeless people? So that's what I'm going to talk about. So there are three main reasons I'm going to cover as we go through. One is that there is no one problem about homelessness. Homelessness is a multifaceted problem. There are problems with homeless families with children. There are rough sleepers, and I'll talk about the difference between these groups. There are single homeless, young people under 25 or up to 30 who are homeless because they're not established in work and they've left their parents' homes or various other, they're students and so on. There are people like refugees who not only can be homeless because they have no established right to stay in the country, but they're denied access to public funds. They have particular problems and issues. And I've included first-time buyers in here for a reason that I'll come to later. Secondly, there's no one cause of homelessness, and I'll be talking about some of the causes. I mean, why do people become homeless? I mean, there are a number of complex interacting things here. First, housing is a source of capital and wealth and not just shelter. So dealing with housing, allocating housing, obtaining housing is not just about somewhere to live, it's about making money. Landlords make money, owner-occupiers make money, lots of people make money out of housing. Secondly, for various reasons, there are just too few homes, too few houses in this country at the moment. There's huge, every government said, we're going to build more homes. Ever since the end of the Second War, people have been promising to build hundreds of thousands of more homes. It never quite catches up with need. There are lots of regional variations. If you want to get a house in the north, in Bolton or Manchester or Newcastle, you can get one tomorrow from the council, because nobody wants, I mean, there's so many council houses there. In London, it's completely the opposite. These are important factors. And as I'll come to, the benefits and tax system can in various ways make homelessness worse. I mean, you would think the government policies and benefits would make things easier to address homelessness, but actually that's not the case. And thirdly, there is no one solution to homelessness. I mean, it's a highly political question, devoting public resources to dealing with homeless people rather than improving the health service or other funding constraints is highly political. And there are constantly changing government programs, constantly changing initiatives from third sector agencies, constantly changing pressures, people who have the answer to solving homelessness that seem to come and go and be funded and then fall apart. There is constant research and analysis on this, but as Christine mentioned, there is also a criminal or a punitive aspect of homelessness. I mean, a number of housing ministers talk about, well, one famously, how terrible it was to step over homeless people when he went to the opera. I mean, and people think that homeless people should be swept from the streets. So I don't think they should be in prison. So these are some of the dimensions of the problem. So this is what I'm going to, in various different ways, talk about as we go through. Right, so the Vagrancy Act is still being used. This is the 1824 Vagrancy Act, which actually there were still suicide prosecutions under this act. This kind of is the punitive element of it. And a number of councils are still started issuing fines for rough sleepers. This is an increasing problem here. What is homelessness? Okay, let's start with statutory definition. Some people have a right to be housed by a local authority in certain limited circumstances. If they don't have accommodation, they have a legal right to occupy. It's got to be accessible, physically available, and reasonable for them to continue living. In other words, you can't have a family of 5 living in one room. That's not, they would be homeless in these conditions. On the other hand, you've got rough sleeping, and as Christine said, this is very different. Rough sleeping has a somewhat strange definition. A rough sleeper is someone who is found sleeping or about to bed down, or actually bedded down, in the open air, such as in the streets, doorways, parks, bus shelters, encampments, or in a building or a place not designed for habitation, which is to say stairwells, barns, sheds, parks, cars, derelict boats, stations, and bashes, which are these cardboard structures that you see homeless people. And these two groups are very different, usually because the rough sleepers are the groups who do not get the statutory help. I mean, roughly speaking. Also, there are people in the middle who are not recognised in any place as homeless. First of all, you've got a number of people who are in temporary accommodation who are probably there because they've been picked up as statutorily homeless and they're waiting for somewhere to stay, but still they stay in accommodation which is really not appropriate, not fit for them. I mean, they're a particular group. But also, there are a large number of people who are not recognised. There's constant pressure to recognise people, like young people who are sofa surfing, young people who are living with their families unwillingly in small rooms, single people without any vulnerabilities who government just thinks, well, that's their problem, they're young, they can get a job and find somewhere to stay. And as I said, people with no recourse to public funds. Now, who else gets brought in? If you listen to housing ministers, they often talk about the real housing problem in Britain is the lack of homes for first-time buyers to purchase. This is a huge scandal. And in fact, it's such a huge scandal that £10 billion was spent on the Help to Buy, is being spent on the Help to Buy programme, which is basically a way to give well-off young people money to buy houses more cheaply. But this is seen as a housing problem. And of course, Right to Buy was another initiative where the stock of council housing available for people who are homeless has gone down and down and down, 2 million down since Right to Buy was introduced. So there are far fewer homes for homeless people to live in because of the Right to Buy provisions. Okay. So briefly, I'll go quickly through this. The 77 Housing Act gave priority needs categorisation to certain people who are here, pregnant women's families and so on, vulnerable people. So they are people who have a right to housing if they are homeless. We defined homeless earlier, and they turn up to the local authority and say, I need a house, I've got nowhere to stay, and they justify that. But of course, there are two extra conditions on this which really date back to vagrancy. One is that they're not intentionally homeless. They've made themselves homeless. They've not paid their rent. So they're feckless in various ways. And secondly, they must have a local connection. They must have some reason to go to one borough rather than another, to go to Tower Hamlets rather than going to Brent or to Newcastle. In other words, I mean, this is a historic continuation of the vagrancy laws. You know, people wandering from place to place in the Middle Ages, and they were just thrown out of a town because they shouldn't be there. There's an aspect of that, if you like. Now, in 2018, there was a new Housing Act introduced called the Homelessness Reduction Act, which introduced a much wider purview of local authorities' jobs. It gave them prevention duties rather than just relief duties. It gave them the duty to actually, people turn up and say, I'm about to be made homeless, I'm at risk of being made, and this was introduced as a new dimension, which is actually very progressive, because it tries to anticipate and prevent people becoming homeless. Then you have the relief duty, which is the duty to house the people that you assess is actually entitled to housing. But that's a really important new development, which everyone's looking to see if it's going to work or not. Local authorities have the job of implementing it. There was a cost analysis done to work out how much money they should get, and as I think we'll probably hear later, it was many times too little. Just who gets priority needs housing? You can see families with dependent children by far make up the biggest group. I mean, these are the groups over from 92 to 2017. And why do people become homeless? This is rather a complicated graph, but basically AST, the end of assured tenancy, is by far the biggest group. These are people who private landlords are now able to evict people at the end of their 6 months tenancy or their year tenancy without any reason whatsoever. And this is now one of the major problems of homelessness. There are also people in temporary accommodation. There are 83,000 households costing $1 billion a year on temporary accommodation. These are the people I said who were housed temporarily in these local authority accommodation. Rough sleeping. Lots of initiatives about rough sleeping. It got a lot better during the Labour years, and it's got a lot worse since then. Not that I'm making a political statement here, it just happens to be that. In fact, on rough sleeping, there's enormous amounts of... Oh, shit, I've got to stop. But I'll carry on just briefly. There's enormous amounts of data. I mean, Chain is a report by street workers of every rough sleeper who is then tracked once they're found. They record all the details about their nationality, where they go, what their health needs are, what happens to them eventually. Here they do maps. There's a map of where rough sleeping is concentrated in London. They distinguish between people who've been on the streets before, people who are just come on for a few weeks and then go off. And they have all this kind of detailed information about what is there. Causes. All right. One thing to say is that Shelter always say everyone is 2 paychecks away from homelessness. Well, that's not actually true. There's been recent analysis done, but there are people who are particularly at risk. People who experience poverty, particularly childhood poverty, and have no social networks are really the key drivers. So I don't know if any of you would fit these categories, but if you don't, then don't worry, you're probably okay. Lack of house building. The number of social housing units is just plummeting over this period with social housing. And benefits no longer cover rents. This is a key thing. Because of what's called the local housing allowance, which caps the amount of benefit you can get to pay for housing, this is a key driver of homelessness. Finally, underfunded services and local authorities, but I'll leave that to my colleague to talk about. Finally, there are other things about homelessness. One is the contested, I mean, nobody agrees quite what to do. The contested approaches. Some people say, just give everybody houses, and that will be fine. Whereas others say, if you give people houses who are homeless or rough sleeping, they will soon abandon them or not be able to cope, and that support is needed. And secondly, the charitable sector and soup runs. Some people say, we must do something. Let's go out and give them sandwiches and soup and coffee. And other people say, if you do that, you will simply encourage them to stay in the streets. They will have somewhere to, something to eat, something warm to go, people looking after them, and they'll just continue their health and drug and other problems that they have. All right, so conclusion. Never mind conclusion. That's it.
10 minutes is a very short time in the context of homelessness. So Mark Baigent, who's come, you've been doing it really well, yes. Mark Baigent is a housing person through and through, local authority person through as well. Known him for 15 years, 20 years, in Greenwich and other local authorities, particularly Tower Hamlets. Works in regeneration. He's worked as, he was also chair of the housing directors of London councils, and it's probably partly that he will talk about. So, Mark,
So yeah, I haven't got a little timer like Bert, so someone just has to shout at me. And I haven't got a presentation because I only found out yesterday at 5 o'clock that I was doing this. So I've got some notes on my iPad. So I may not fill 10 minutes, but we'll see how we get on. I am going to talk about the local authority perspective because that's what I know, that's what I've worked in for 30 years. And I'm not really going to talk much at all about rough sleepers and that kind of street homelessness end of things. I mean, I think Bert actually showed we know how to fix it. It was done, and then it all got worse again. So I think that there are solutions, and we know what they are, and it does cost money, and it does take time. But I think that's solvable. I think really what I want to talk about is the wider homelessness problems, which Bert really clearly defined and explained. So I don't need to do that. So the local authority perspective is very clear. Every London borough, and there are 32 London boroughs and the City of London Corporation, every one of them has a legal obligation, which has been explained to you, that if someone comes to us and says, I'm homeless, I'm threatened with homelessness, we have to investigate, we have to find out what's going on in that person's life, and we have to do certain things if certain boxes are ticked in terms of their situation. That costs money. That involves employing staff, training them, and it involves spending a lot of money on providing accommodation for people. And I'll talk a little bit about how that has changed over the last couple of years since the new legislation that Bert talked about. What I do want to say about the problem and the cause question, from my point of view, homelessness is a symptom of a bigger problem. It isn't in itself the problem. And for me, the bigger problem, the government actually recognised it in the white paper and they named it. They said we have a broken housing market. And for me, that has lots of wider implications, but homelessness in all its forms is fundamentally a symptom of the housing market in this country that just doesn't work. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, and we're not going to talk about them tonight. But in very simple terms, for London councils, we need to provide affordable housing, we need to provide social housing, and for many reasons, historically and particularly now, that isn't coming through the production line at the pace that it needs to keep up with demand. And so councils are having to put people into temporary accommodation who they would much rather put straight into a brand new council flat. And that's really the number one answer, but it just takes a very long time to turn that particular system from a broken system into one that works. And I don't think we have all the answers to that. So you saw the headline numbers of households who are accepted as having a statutory homelessness duty with local authorities. And in London, it's around 55,000 households. And the majority of those are families, so something like 80% of those, there are children involved. So we're probably talking about something like 80,000 children living in temporary accommodation in London at the moment. That is a huge number of children growing up in what we know from research is a situation which is going to impact their life chances, whether we're talking about health and well-being, whether we're talking about educational outcomes, just general kind of social interaction and networking. So it's something that, from the point of view of people who work in the public sector, we really don't want to see that perpetuated for those children growing up in that situation. And what I've witnessed over the last 10, 15 years is the length of time that families are spending in temporary accommodation has increased substantially. So when I started out, 20 years ago, a family would be accepted as homeless. They might spend a year or two in temporary accommodation and then they'd be moving into a permanent council flat. It's now typically 5 years, sometimes it's 10 years, sometimes it's more than 10 years. And you think, well, hold on, those children have grown up by now. They're teenagers. They're now facing their own housing prospects as individuals coming round the corner, and they've lived their whole life in temporary accommodation. Just can't be right, can it? So that is the kind of problem we're up against. And that partly reflects the fact that councils haven't wanted to be seen to reward homelessness. It's a funny thing to say, but they don't want to create a perverse incentive for people to make themselves homeless or find themselves homeless, and they want to make sure that people apply for housing through a waiting list rather than skipping the queue and becoming homeless. The other thing I think to say in terms of the type of accommodation people are in, so a lot of temporary accommodation isn't bed and breakfast hotels, isn't a whole family in one room. That's the image that's presented as the worst case, and it's dreadful that continues. But the majority of those 55,000 households will be in a self-contained flat. The problem for those families is that they have absolutely no security. So at any time, the council can say, right, well, actually, we need that flat for somebody else, we're going to move you. And so they can go through a series of moves, and what that does in terms of stability, going back to the issues around children and wider stability in society that creates all of that. I've got a minute left, have I? 2 minutes left. Okay. So London Council's commissioned LSE to do some research, and what they found was that since the new legislation came in 2018, which we support in principle, as Bert said, it's very progressive, but actually it has increased the number of cases that we're dealing with. It's increased the time it takes to deal with people, and therefore the cost of dealing with homelessness for councils in London has gone up, but the budgets provided by government have hardly gone up at all. So there's a huge lack of funding, and London as a whole will be spending over £1 billion a year within a couple of years on homelessness. So that's going to hit London taxpayers as well. One of the key things that we need is for the local housing allowance that Bert mentioned to be increased to a level that actually reflects the true cost of market rented accommodation, because that is what councils are having to place people into in order to deal with homelessness. And at the moment they're having to pay way over the LHA level, and it's just not sustainable. I think the only other thing I was going to mention is that councils are beginning to collaborate more. And one of the things that I led on in the last couple of years with London councils was setting up collaborative vehicles to procure accommodation from the private sector, to buy modular housing to use for temporary accommodation. And I think this is something to watch in terms of going forward, that councils will begin to actually do things on a sub-regional or regional basis rather than effectively competing with each other. And hopefully through that approach they'll take more of a controlling position in terms of their relationship with the private market that provides all of this temporary accommodation. Happy to finish there. Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, there are some really complicated things involved with all of that. In particular, is long-term people who are called legacy homeless, who've been in homeless accommodation for over 10 years, since the beginning of 2011, they're called now. And they, because they were homeless in 2010, have a right to social housing. But there isn't any social housing to give them, so they stay in temporary accommodation. They could move to private renting, but they feel that waiting for a long-term secure home is worthwhile. So there are massive problems with it. We're now going to turn with Patrick Mulrenan to the issue of students, which seems to be relevant to a proportion of the audience.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invite.
You've also been involved in a while.
I have been involved in housing a long while, and in fact, in a previous job, I did mystery shopping and presented myself as homeless across various boroughs in London. So.
Did they think you were homeless?
I was quite convincing. This is going to focus on the personal aspect of homelessness. A couple of years ago, I got a couple of £1,000 to do a piece of research. I didn't know what to do it on, and I was thinking about it, and I realised that after I do lecture on homelessness, I almost always have one or two of my students come up and say, I'm homeless, I'm in temporary accommodation. So I thought, that looks like an interesting area. So we sent out an email, and I talked to a couple of colleagues, and we thought maybe across the university we might get 10 students, maybe, who are homeless. I sent out an email just to our school, which is 1 in 7 schools at the university. I immediately got 29 emails back from students who are homeless, just in one school. I was quite shocked by that. And that's people, that would be a tip of an iceberg, because most people are not going to respond to email, and they're quite embarrassed about being homeless, which came out of research. Just from one email, what we decided to do in the end was we had a focus group of 5 students and 11 students in-depth interviews. So what I'm going to take you through briefly is what they said to us, and it's kind of the human aspect. We talked a lot about policy, but in terms of real people, how does it affect our students, and how do they stay at university? Profile of the people we talked to, roughly similar to the profile of our university and our school. 14 women, 2 men, 3 were white, 12 black Caribbean, black African and mixed, 11 women with children, and a range of different ages. So that kind of reflects our population, certainly within the School of Social Professions. We have a lot of parents, we have a lot of older students who have got real challenges, and among those challenges is being homeless. We looked at the impact of homelessness, and the question was, well, if you're homeless in temporary accommodation, how do you actually manage to remain at university? How do you keep it going? And the answers we got was the impact was pretty dreadful. The people in temporary accommodation, Mark referred to it, mainly in the private rented sector, you kind of have no rights. If you complain, the landlord can then just end your tenancy a couple of months later and get rid of you. I put in some quotes from some of the students. One said, we had no water, no taps in the bathroom, the entire flat was damp and wet, we lost clothes, we lost furniture. It was really quite awful, and I should say all of the students I interviewed cried. Every single one of them cried, but none of them had actually gone to the university and told them they're homeless. None of them. Overcrowding is a big issue. I don't usually put a lot of quotes on slides, but I think it's important you hear directly what people said. Everything is too much. My daughter's speech is delayed because we do not have enough room for her. We can't bring friends in so she can interact. I tried to take her down the park. There's no room to get your friends in, your children's friends. And one of the students said she's so overcrowded, she didn't want to cry in front of her children, but she had to wait until her child went to bed, basically. You know, she put her child to bed, then she could cry about being homeless. Constant worrying is they're always concerned. While they're, you know, sitting in a room like this in a lecture hall, they wouldn't be looking at me. They'd be thinking, I've got to get home. I've got to sort out the damp. I've got to sort this out. I've got to talk to the council. One said, I'd have peace of mind if I had a home to myself, even a room to put my child in. Another said, even when she's doing presentations, she's thinking, I've got to look at Gumtree. That was a single student. And, you know, one of them was saying, when they were on the bus, she had to take, you know, a lot of the students had to take their kids to school, and they're being placed in boroughs a long way away from where they're at home, so they go back to original school, drop them off, come into university, leave immediately at 4:30, go back, collect the kids, go back home, sort out their kids, 10 o'clock, then they start academic work. So they're kind of constantly transported across London. One of them had been placed in 8 different flats in 9 years. So moving, and eventually end up in Slough. So she came into university from Slough. But one of the things, it's sort of a positive thing in a way, is that the students really felt being a student was really helpful to them. It gave them at least some space where they could stop thinking about being homeless. And one of the students said, you enter inside, well, it's London Met University, obviously. You feel different, the pressure's gone, you feel like you're accomplishing something, but the moment you go, the pressure starts up again. Because you've got to pick your kids up, get back home, do all of those sorts of things. So it really had quite a bad impact personally on students, and they really struggled, and I felt really bad actually, because I'm always telling students off, you know, they're getting at 10 past 10, why are you late? You know, you've got to concentrate on your studies, and they'd already done a full day's work getting their kids to school and all those sorts of things. In terms of how they stayed at university, we said, I came up with the 4 Fs, and I wish I hadn't, because I ended up sort of, what F is this? What F is this? And I wish I had just not done this, but I did it. The family, pride, fortitude, faith and friendship were the 4 things. So that's a bit, if you're doing a bit of research for students here, don't try and be clever and do things like this, because it just doesn't work. Family pride was an interesting one. Most of our students are from BAME communities, 2/3 from BAME communities, 2/3 from the bottom 2 quintiles. So we tend to have students who are from poor socioeconomic backgrounds and from ethnic minorities, and mainly women. Family pride is a big one, but it wasn't, they sometimes weren't the first person to go to university, but they're real pride in the first person going to a British university. And one of my students from Nigeria said, my father talks a lot to people, my daughter's in England and studying a degree, and that came out really strongly. That sense of pride at being at university was a real comfort to them, and a reason to stay at university. Children was another massive, that was the big finding of the research, there's a lot of research about parents of students and how they influence their children's choices going to university, but the influence on these students was their children. And they wanted to be a really positive role model for their children. So, you know, there was a real sense of pride. And they said, you know, I just look at my children, want to be proud of me. I won't go through all the quotes, but you won't have time. 2 minutes, right. One said, because I'm a teenage mum, I know most teenage mums don't have anything, and I don't want to be one of those statistics. And that's the key thing, the key role of children keeping it going. So I'm sorry I can't give you the quotes, but the quotes are here if you want to go back on them. Fortitude, the sense of strength, they felt they'd been hardened by their battles, a real sort of personal resilience and pride in what they're doing. One woman said, I didn't know what strong was until it was required. And one said, I feel like I've got a degree in housing the stuff I've been through. So, you know, they'd learned as they'd gone along. The key thing is they had something to aim for. That kept them going, because they knew they could see themselves, almost picture themselves getting a degree. They're forcing themselves through the university to get that picture of graduating. So they're desperate to get to that stage, but obviously the homelessness was a real problem. But because they were so proud and strong, they'd never told the university. They didn't tell anyone at the university, they hadn't told their friends, some of them hadn't told their families. And it's a real problem for our advice services because they haven't been told that people are homeless because they're embarrassed about being homeless. This one was a real surprise. We didn't think of this when we started the research. We have quite a lot of religious students, and for those students who are religious, that was the source of their fortitude, of going through the university. As one student said, God gives his battles to the hardest soldier. And there was a lot of stuff around religion. We didn't expect that, you know, because we hadn't thought of it, which is good because when you do research, you're supposed to find out things you don't know, and we didn't know that. The university, it's interesting, university with the religious element is sometimes there's a bit of a contradiction, or people feel their religion doesn't fit into universities. Final one, which is pretty well known, is that people, so if you want to stay at university, make a friend. That's the key thing. Get into a group, make a friend. That's the key determinant to staying at university. But of course, they had to go home at 4 o'clock, so they didn't mix in the evenings. They didn't have money or time to mix in the evenings, so they didn't get that sense of friendship. Although they enjoyed just having a cup of coffee with an adult, was a sense of real enjoyment and resilience for them. Implications. We don't know how many students are homeless. We don't know those statistics. It seems like there's probably a lot of them, but we don't measure it. I think universities need to focus on resilience of students, focus on their strengths rather than their weaknesses to keep them at university and attract students. And I think universities tend to have this thing of appealing to students who we haven't got the students we had 40 years ago. We need to deal with the students we've got now. You know, not kind of pretend it's 40 years ago. I've got my personal bugbear is office hours. I don't know why lecturers have office hours. You know, you all come here at 2 o'clock on Friday and see me. It just seems really odd to me. Sorry. Half a minute ago, what did we do? Well, I had £2,000. I spent £1,000 on the research. So I had £1,000 left over, and the university kindly said one of the key things that came out was a relationship with children. What they didn't want the homeless family, the homeless students, we said, was something specially for homeless people. They didn't want to be labelled as homeless. They didn't want to be treated specially. And what we talked to them about in the end, we spent £1,000 setting up a children's day at the university. So there was a special day at half term when they could bring their kids into university, and they can have face painting and see what the mum and dad does. And the BA Performing Arts did some arts with them, and we had Gilbert Giggles the clown, who was very good. And it was a fantastic day. And I have to say, on this day, I was really worried about it because I thought, how many tickets are going to get sold? We didn't sell them, they're free, but how many people are going to come? I bet nobody comes. I was really worried. So we did an Eventbrite page, and 250 had gone within 4 hours. People were desperate to bring their kids into university, and we spend our time keeping them out. So thank you. That's it. I'll just about
Thank you very much indeed. Well, we covered a wide range from basic statistics, which come from the central government, and to be perfectly honest, as we're now working with them all the time, on the whole, they see this as a numbers problem and how the numbers add up and therefore the costs that are involved. And they think that if somebody is housed in a perfectly good 2-bedroom flat, then they are very well housed. And I've been looking for other reasons at temporary accommodation in areas where we'd all love to live. And the difference between the flat which is temporary accommodation and the flat next door which is private renting, and that flat next door which is social renting, is amazing. And fundamentally, it's not the physicality, although it is the repair and maintenance and whether the heating works. It's about the factors which you will raise in your context and students. So we have 20 odd minutes for questions, comments, knowledgeable thoughts. So, we'll start with you.
Yes, but one more sorry. You mentioned that if they're homeless, one of them come to you, or one of them 32 dollars. You will do something for them. Give me a feeling you will offer them a kind of temporary home. But in that case, why the people, the homeless, don't come to you? Because I have talked with a few in London. They give me a feeling, speak very good English. I ask them, why do you stay here in such state? They said, yes, actually I have a home, but not in London, in other places. I don't want to stay there, so I come here. That's another reason, why don't they come to you? Is that the case, if they come to you, instead of giving them a home, you will send them back? In that case, they will come, yes or no?
So if they do have a property in another part of the country which they can live in, we wouldn't encourage them to go there, and we wouldn't give them, temporary accommodation in London.
You might give them a train ticket.
We'd help them. Yeah, we'd do more than give them a train ticket. We'd contact somebody in the place where they've got a home to make sure that they're supported into relocating. So we would help them do that. But we wouldn't accommodate them in London if they had a home somewhere else, unless, as Bert said, unless there's a good reason why they can't live there, which means that it's unreasonable for us to send them back.
And that is true even between boroughs. Some boroughs will take people from other boroughs, but mostly they will send them back to the other borough.
The thing about the local connection, if someone doesn't have a local connection anywhere, we still have a duty to help them. We can't say to them, well, just go away. But we will work very hard to find a local connection for them somewhere. Because most people have got one once you dig a bit deeper.
You wanted to?
Yeah. So I run a homeless charity as well, and kind of told us to try to use technology to sort of facilitate information sharing and things like that. And
Can you speak up a bit?
of course. So I'm thinking a bit about sort of the role in which lack of information has in fueling this problem. So, for instance, my co-founder is a housing lawyer, housing legal firm. If we send users to her, very quickly she can come with a solution of where to send them, what grants to fill out for them, and actually, she's put 7 people out of homelessness this year herself. What sort of barriers to information sharing do you see for the council level?
Just to start, I think to some extent, the HRA, the Homeless Reduction Act, is trying to say, look, it doesn't matter what type of person you are, it doesn't matter if you're single or not having other special needs, etc. You can still come and get some sort of help. The question, I think, which I don't know the answer to, is what sort of help do you get? Do you get enough help to find out what you can do? So that would be the, obviously we have other things, but that would be
maybe to flesh out some of the information I'm talking about. So, for instance, it's not just can you go to this hospital or can you get housing in this borough. It's some of the auxiliary support networks. So, and how do you get into a foundation course at university for a certain age, or how do you train to be a barrister or that sort of information. It seems sometimes it's a bit detached from the local level. I just wondered if you had any experience or ideas on that.
I certainly think that local authorities are working very hard to join up the different services that interact with people to get in early to prevent homelessness, which is, that's why this new legislation is such a good thing in principle, but to do it properly costs money and involves training staff to think, just as you're saying, to think of all of those connections. So, for example, in Tower Hamlets, where I was working recently, there has been a project to go into GP surgeries, to go into job centres, to find people who we know are showing all the signs of being at risk of homelessness and get to them before the crisis happens. And that's been really effective. But that's maybe helped 100 people into our hamlets, and then how can we get that spread out so that everyone benefits?
Does it have a name, that program?
Yes, it does. I'm trying to remember it.
It's the No Wrong Door. I'm actually from Tower Hamlet. One of the things the Homeless Reduction Act asks us to do is to develop what we call a personal housing plan. So each local authority housing advisor is actually meant to holistically look at the needs and what led to the homelessness. So it's not just helping them to find a new accommodation, it's also actually finding out what led to the initial homelessness. So any good local authority has an option officer should actually be exploring what the other issues are. So if a student, for example, ideally they should be linking them up and capturing that in the personal housing plan. So I'm not sure how dynamic each local authority works, but part of what the HRA asks local authorities to do.
Do you mind if I just say that? It's an interesting one, that, because I did some shadowing in the previous job, just watching how homeless services work. And at the end of the homeless interviews, I would go out and talk to the person just being through the homelessness interview, and they never understood what was just happening. They didn't have the knowledge to understand what process they've just been through. And if I'll give you a completely true example, is in one interview, I don't know why, the person said to the homeless person, "Have you got a car?" And they looked puzzled and said no. And I went out and said, "How did that interview go? Did you understand?" And they said, "Why did he ask me if I had a cow?" So they're stuck in this situation where they just, and people just go, it's so complex, homelessness, so a lot of staff who are implemented.
One of the things in that context, which I've come across, I think 3 times a day, but in other contexts as well, is how much more emphasis is being put on mentoring or having somebody who is on that person's side and who can help fill in a form, who can help with these sorts of things. I was talking to somebody who's doing that in the Royal Court of Justice, so that everybody got some assistance with that process this afternoon. And I think mentoring in that sort of sense is coming up, but of course in your context, they're not even getting to a point where they ask for help. Asking for help is a very difficult thing to do. So, Madam.
What would you see in terms of improving the ability of people in these situations to organise or advocate for themselves so that they have a voice in decisions?
Well, we've talked about the personalised living plans that are being developed. I mean, if I talk about rough sleeping, I mean, one of the issues about rough sleeping is support given to rough sleepers. So the process in London is street outreach teams will find people, try and arrange for them to be taken for assessment for health or dependency or other rights issues in the way that you talked about. But then that when they're in assessment centres or temporary accommodation, they will have a support worker who will address all of these issues on a long-term basis, because it's not just getting basic rights. Are you entitled to housing? Actually, you've got a statutory right because you've got a disability, so you can be housed for the council. Or no, you don't have a statutory right, but actually you can claim benefits. You don't have an NI number. You've lost your passport. And there's a whole series of things which can be helped. But when they move into housing, even permanent housing, often they will not have basic life skills. They will. A number of us speakers don't know that you can buy food and cook it.
I suppose for a while, specifically of the rough sleepers, there were experiments with things like personalisation and personal budgets and so on. And similarly, there have been some small campaigns, I'm thinking about Peach in Newham, where temporary tenants have organised and become sort of advocates. So I'm thinking a lot of these services are local authorities or charities sort of planning what people need for them, and I'm wondering to what extent is there that parallel voice to move?
I think one of the problems here, talk about something else that we did, which was work for another local authority in the centre of London, where we went to talk to people who had been in were in temporary accommodation, and some of them had been there for 10 years. None of them had seen any local authority person during the time that they were in it. Now, it was different from us sleepers, but they literally had not had any communication, let alone anything else apart from a note saying, you know, remember to do this. But nobody had come to see them. We were the first people who had come and talked to them. I found it amazing. So,
just on that point, I can't work out the economics. Perhaps Mark could help us here. Because, I mean, you say there's 32 boroughs in London. Well, there must be 1 out of 32, which is finding ways of dealing with the situation. I know the circumstances differ. Westminster and Kensington and Chelsea are much wealthier, so they should be doing more. But, of course, they outsource the problem to Harlow and Essex and places like that.
so the other ones, I tell you.
Yes, but I mean, I do think the mayor of London has to be a London-based solution, or a remedy of some sort. So maybe the boroughs could actually bring pressure on London to fund maybe 4, in terms of our sleepers, for instance, 4 large hospitals. Now, I know they existed in the past, and they have bad reputations, despite all that. My understanding is there's so much empty property in London, incredible empty property. But it's, as you were I think you were insinuating, it's more than just empty property. You've got to find the staffing. People have to know how to deal with people with problems.
I mean, you know a lot about the numbers of times that London boroughs have tried to do things together.
Yeah. I mean, I think on the rough sleeping point, as I said, I think that the mayor does have a role. He's taking it very seriously and he's working with boroughs. So I was taking part in a task force for the last couple of years for Tower Hamlets with the mayor and a number of other boroughs. And, you know, we do know what works, and it needs more government money, it needs more, as you say, trained people who know what they're doing. But I think on that front, we know what to do. I think on the bigger homeless families in terms of accommodation problem, it is very, very hard to resolve because the finance isn't in the system, and we're so reliant on the private sector, which isn't really delivering what we need. So what some councils are now doing is they're going out and buying properties just to use as temporary accommodation, but they're buying ex-right to buy properties that they sold 10, 15, 20 years ago at much inflated prices. But at least they're securing some accommodation for those families.
The 3 over here. Oh, sorry, Pat.
Sorry, just in response to the question, a really interesting question. I was thinking about this last week about how, because there's the figure that shocks me is that there's 135,000 children in temporary accommodation across the country. That's the population of Cambridge, same, of children in temporary accommodation. And what other group doesn't have a kind of representative body of that size, you know, some sort of hub where they can get support? It just seems really odd that there's this complete dearth of that sort of service where people are put in contact with one another. But there's a project for you.
But there's also the issue of, as they said, a your day event. They didn't just want to do the homeless.
Yeah, exactly. You have to follow it really carefully.
At the back, and then you.
Some question for Patrick for the student presentation. I wasn't sure as to whether there is something which kind of intersects being a student and being homeless in your station. Or it was mainly, there's homeless people who are or in insecure accommodation who are incidentally also students. And from your presentation, it seemed more that actually this is part of the coping strategy and resilience. That they try to secure the resources for, not being homeless in the future. And I was wondering whether, as an academic, what I need to know is how this affects the studies rather than how being a student affects the homelessness.
Right. Well, it affects their studies in the sense that they find it difficult to get in, they find it difficult to get home, they find it difficult to concentrate. The whole thing, and actually going back to your original question, which was about why is there an increase, is that there's a government policy over the last 30 years to widen participation to groups that non-traditional groups who haven't gone to university, which is a fantastic policy. But we're encouraging very good groups who are most likely to be homeless international almost problem. It's not. It's a national problem, an international problem. Why are people homeless in nowhere? I don't think it's within the remit of the university necessary to provide accommodation, but it can provide extra support to people who are homeless. But first of all, we've got to find out who they are, and we haven't even got to that stage yet. So, it's a really interesting question.
I was involved about 20 odd years ago in setting up housing for you. And it was a flavour of the month in 1990. I just wondered what happened to that. Was it the funding just wasn't enough, or you know, I know there was a YMCA playing some role similar, don't they? But it seems very good to me at the time. It seemed like a very good way of addressing young single homeless, particularly people who aren't going to university.
Foyers was originally a French idea, which was for young people. It was very popular at one point, so we did an evaluation of it, to see what was good and bad. But I think they fundamentally got integrated into housing associations that became bigger and they're not very obviously an element in the game now.
I think they are still some. They don't call themselves foyers anymore, maybe. The word may have gone, but I think the YMCA is still doing that kind of work.
And certainly the evidence was that this was a way of helping education and support for a relatively small number of people.
There's the Boyer Foundation as well. They have around 40 plus people.
Yeah. So it kept moving. I used to visit them.
Not a question. Obviously, one of the big things that you've identified is the sheer lack of housing, and you were all talking about it. And we're not going to crack that in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. That's turning up a very slow line. But just suppose we might have a new government in a few weeks' time, imagine. I was wondering which of the sorts of policy things that you've talked about you would regard as the most likely to deliver results quicker. You know, is it getting the housing benefit level back up? Is it changing tenure security law? And never, all of the above is not allowed. Is it just funding the new duties that you talked about? You know, which of them would produce quick results, and which of them are a slow burn in behind the whole housing supply side question?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I would say Section 21 was getting some reasonable security of tenure would help enormously. The LHA situation is horrendous. I mean, we have a system which was built on the idea that a minimum standard was defined by a set of rules, and you had to have that amount of money. But if the LHA isn't covering your rent, if you've got no income, then you are not able to eat. It's as simple as that. And that is just not any longer part of the way that people think. I went and had long conversations with the IFS, Internet Finance people, who are meant to know about these things. And the young people, I'm sorry, I'm talking about the young people in this context, but literally because the generation had not learned it, did not know that the principle was to have that basic minimum input. They thought it was about choice, that you should be able to go and choose to go and live in Birkenhead in order to be able to afford your housing. And this is a nonsense in my system. So I would, if you want to do immediate things on your private rented sections, there is a real worry that will impact on the amount of private rented accommodation. So I've answered this instead of the others, but they can have, if you don't all mind staying 5 minutes, they can have a minute to come up with the best idea. But we'll have.
Just one question. There's £1 billion going on housing benefits. Isn't it really sensible that that money gets invested actually in developing housing rather than giving it to private landlords providing shit houses?
Which council has been saying for 20 years, to be really honest with you. It's not that, what you just said is not a new thing to be said.
I know it's been talked about for that long, and nothing's happened.
It's beginning to happen that local authorities are investing in building new council housing in London. There were 2,000 plus new properties started on site last year, funded by the Mayor of London. And there are, as I said, lots of councils are going out and buying properties because that's actually quicker than developing new things. You know, you can actually go out and buy stuff and make use of that for total accommodation. So there are things being done with that money rather than just paying private landlords.
One thing and then one minute each.
I have a question. I speak now not as a staff of a local authority, but as a parent.
Sure.
I have a daughter who is in university at the moment. I know that students are not eligible for housing benefit. The student grants they get, they cannot afford any single shared accommodation rate. Is there anything being done?
No.
Is there a voice? Is there a lobby? Is there anything that's been escalated up to the government to actually ask local authorities to give more realistic grants to students who are very disadvantaged, especially those who cannot afford to pay the rents that we have out there?
We no longer believe in grants, we only give loans.
We only give loans out, but then we want people to go to university.
Being good. No, one of the things is that we've made everything very, very much more complicated. And everywhere where you look, you are changing the way the incentives work. But anyway, Patrick, you still asked, you can have your first one then.
Right, I want it. I think I'm going to concentrate actually on the right to buy it. Because what Mark was saying earlier is councils are building 2,000 homes, and that's absolutely fantastic. But while they're building 2,000 homes, they're obliged to sell off 10,000. So it's like running a tap with a plug out really, because you're never going to fill that half because there's constantly draining out the right to buy. I understand why people exercise right to buy because it's a rational choice. You know, it's about you get money off your property. I understand that. But as a social policy, it's a bit disastrous. And I think Bert might have heard this earlier. It's a mad situation where people exercise the right to buy. In London, half of those people then privately rent it out to other people, among which are councils who then rent that property out to house their homeless families in temporary accommodation. At 4 times the price.
Because they may have it managed by a housing association, which is only interested in maximising the money they get out of it.
If there's one policy, it's not going to build any new homes, but at least they're losing certain homes.
And it's one reason why you don't build them now. Right, your 1 minute.
Okay, so I'm not going to quick wins here. The long term, actually the most important thing is around skills and training, about career choices, because we don't have the workforce for the construction industry to build the new homes we need. And no one's mentioned Brexit yet, but they're all going to go if that happens. And in the local authority sector, again, even if the government gave us loads of extra money to deal with homelessness, we need the staff trained, expert, empathic, all of the things we've talked about, and they don't grow on trees. We've got to train them up, and that takes time. That's what we need, is a big national training program.
So you can have the last one.
So answering two of the questions at the same time. One of the most effective things would be rent capping. Because if you cap rents, you can cap them at a level that benefits can meet, which means you're not spending the billions because the rents are so high. It delivers affordability to a much wider range of people so they don't become homeless, they can pay their rent. And there's not the incentive of landlords to evict people at the end and serve 6 months simply to raise the rent because there's somebody else who's willing to get it. So, but of course, politically, it is very difficult because the interest of the property market, the interest of the landlords, these issues are very seen by politically as very important. Which is why it's crazy. It's not crazy if you're in that political camp.
Okay. We've ranged. But it is a really important and difficult subject which raises all these different types of subjects. So, Tony, what's the next one?
So the next one
thank you all very, very much.